Troy Roberts made Rockford High his personal kingdom, a bully who did as he pleased. Jay Collins was one of his favorite targets. Pushed, beaten, mocked, and with a powerful father to protect him, Troy never faced consequences. Jay endured it day after day, year after year. He learned to keep his head down, to take the blows, to pretend it didn't matter. But it did. Then one day, everything changed. Jay came home beaten worse than ever, and for the first time his father, David Collins, a former Delta Force operative, saw the truth. The bruises, the unspoken weight of years of suffering, and he made a decision: no more. His father pushed him beyond his limits, teaching him what it meant to stand his ground, to take control, to strike back with precision and power. And when the moment finally came, Jay didn't hesitate. Troy thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning sun cast a golden glow over Rockford High, its red brick exterior standing tall against the crisp autumn air. Students spilled into its halls in clusters, some engaged in carefree laughter, others moving in silent indifference. To most, this was just another day, another cycle of classes and routine. But for Jay, every step through these corridors carried the weight of an unspoken truth. This school wasn't built for kids like him. He had learned early on that silence was often the safest response, that choosing to look away instead of engaging could mean the difference between making it through the day or being swallowed whole by the ever-present undercurrent of hostility that Rockford carried. It wasn't always blatant. Sometimes it was a sharp glance when he raised his hand in class, a smirk when he walked past a table in the cafeteria, a laugh when he brushed shoulders with someone who acted like he didn't belong. Other times, though, it was clearer, sharper, unmistakable in its intent. Like now, Jay barely had time to register the rough shove against his shoulder before his books hit the ground, his body stumbling forward as the crowded hallway split apart. A familiar voice carried over the chatter, loud and taunting. "Oops, didn't see you there, Jay." Troy stood there, smirking, eyes glinting with something sharp, something cruel. His friends loomed behind him, entertained, amused, watching Jay with the expectation that he would do what he always did: pick up his books, ignore the insult, and walk away. Jay exhaled slowly, steadying himself, forcing his expression to remain blank, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. "I said," Troy continued, stepping closer, his voice dropping just enough for only Jay to hear. "Watch where you're walking, boy." "Oh." A ripple of tension rolled through the surrounding students. Some turned away, pretending not to hear. Others exchanged uneasy glances. But no one spoke. No one ever did. Jay's jaw tightened. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the familiar burn of frustration that came with moments like these. The battle between wanting to react and knowing what it would cost him if he did. He had been raised better than this. His father had taught him that some fights weren't worth having, that some battles only fed the enemy. But standing there, staring into Troy's smirking face, he wondered if that was always true. Before the thought could settle, before he could do anything, Troy struck again. A hand against his chest, a shove harder this time, forcing him back a step. "What's wrong?" Troy grinned, voice dripping with mock innocence. "Aren't you going to do something? Or are you just going to stand there like a good little—" The sudden weight of silence swallowed the rest of his words. The hush in the hallway stretched thin as everyone watched, waiting, breath held in anticipation. Jay felt his hands clench at his sides. He could hear his father's voice in his head. "Don't react in anger. Control the fight before it begins." But how much longer was he supposed to take this? Seconds stretched thick with expectation. In the end, Jay did what he had always done. He let out a slow breath, forced his hands to relax, then bent down and started gathering his books. Laughter rippled through the crowd as Troy chuckled, satisfied, nudging one of the books further away with his foot. "Smart choice, Jay. Stay in your lane." Then he was gone, disappearing down the hall with his entourage, their laughter fading. Jay remained on the cold tile floor, staring at the pages of his notebook, the words he had written that morning, words that suddenly felt so small, so meaningless. He knew what people would say, that he had done the right thing, that walking away was the mature response, that violence wasn't the answer. But deep down, as he pushed himself to his feet and met the cautious eyes of the few students who lingered, he knew the truth. He had lost again. And he wasn't sure how many more losses he could take. By the time he made it home that evening, the frustration had settled into something deeper, heavier, something that burned under his skin. He stood in the garage, fists slamming against the worn-out punching bag, the dull thud echoing in the quiet. David Collins, standing near the tool bench, watched his son from the corner of his eye. He wasn't the type to pry, never had been, but he wasn't blind either. The way Jay's movements carried a tension that wasn't there before. The way his shoulders had started holding the weight of something unspoken. The way he never quite met his father's gaze anymore. It told him all he needed to know. Something was wrong, but Jay wasn't ready to say it. Not yet. So David let it be. "For now, you're wasting energy," he said finally, voice even, measured. "Your stance is too stiff. Every punch should be controlled, not thrown just to feel something." "Irie." Jay stilled for only a moment before exhaling sharply, stepping back, shaking out his hands. He hesitated, frustration catching in his throat before he shook his head. "I don't know. It just doesn't feel like enough." David studied him for a long moment before stepping forward, pressing a hand against the bag, stilling it completely. "Enough for what?" Jay didn't answer. His father held his gaze, waiting. But when no words came, he nodded slightly, stepping back, letting the silence settle. "You want to learn how to fight?" he asked after a moment, voice calm, deliberate. Jay hesitated only a second before nodding. David's lips quirked slightly, something sharp and knowing flashing in his eyes. "Then we start tomorrow." Jay felt his pulse quicken, but this time, it wasn't frustration burning in his chest. It was something else, something new, something that tasted like resolve. The days blurred together in a cycle that had long become familiar. Jay walked the halls of Rockford High, blending into the background, avoiding unnecessary conflict, knowing all too well that a wrong move could turn an already uncomfortable existence into something far worse. He had gotten good at maneuvering around the school's unspoken rules, at recognizing the moments where speaking up wasn't worth the fallout, at choosing restraint over resistance, because that's what had always been expected of him. But something had shifted after that last encounter with Troy. Maybe it was the way Troy had laughed as he walked away, that smug, entitled expression, as if the outcome had never been in question. Maybe it was the way the students had looked at Jay afterward, not with pity or sympathy, but with quiet acceptance, as if his humiliation had been inevitable. Or maybe it was the way his father had studied him in the garage that night. The knowing look in his eyes as he spoke of control, of finishing fights rather than starting them. Whatever it was, it lingered. It burned beneath the surface, silent but persistent, fueling every hour he spent in the gym after school. Every session where his father pushed him harder, correcting his form, refining his movements, making him faster, stronger. There was no grand speech, no dramatic declaration about revenge, just repetition, discipline, control. Each lesson drilled into him a single truth. Strength wasn't about throwing the first punch. It was about knowing when to strike and making it count. And yet, when the moment finally came, when he found himself standing in the Rockford High parking lot face to face with Troy and his crew, all of that training, all of that preparation felt like a distant memory. The sun had barely started its descent when Jay heard his name called across the lot, a voice laced with mockery and something sharper, anticipation. He had felt it all day, The way Troy had been watching him in class. The way his presence had loomed heavier than usual. And now, as Jay turned to see him leaning casually against his car, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the edges of his mouth, he knew exactly what was about to happen. A few students had gathered, lingering near their own cars, some exchanging quiet murmurs, others pretending not to watch. But they were watching. They always watched. Jay forced himself to stay calm, to keep his expression unreadable, as Troy pushed off his car and took a slow, deliberate step forward. His voice carried over the quiet hum of conversation. "Heard you've been working out, Jay?" He mused, tilting his head slightly, like he was genuinely curious. "That true?" Jay didn't respond. Troy's smirk widened. "Oh, come on. I think it's cute. You really thought lifting a few weights was going to make a difference?" He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, his voice lowering just slightly. "You don't belong here, and nothing you do is ever going to change that." "Oh," Jay swallowed, forcing himself to stand still, to keep his breathing even. But Troy could sense hesitation, and hesitation was weakness. The first shove came fast, harder than usual, enough to send Jay stumbling back a step. The crowd stirred. Jay steadied himself, inhaling sharply, trying to push back the instinct to react. Troy's eyes gleamed with amusement, sensing the restraint, the effort. And he wasn't done. Another shove, even harder this time. Jay's back hit the side of a car. Laughter rippled through the group. Something inside Jay coiled tight. He could hear his father's voice in his head. "You don't win fights by reacting. You win them by controlling the fight before it begins." But right now, Troy had control. Jay wasn't ready. And Troy knew it. A sharp crack rang out as Troy's hand slapped Jay across the face. An open palm hit meant for humiliation rather than damage. The sound split through the air, sending a fresh wave of laughter through the onlookers. Jay's face burned. His breath stilled in his chest. And just like that, every ounce of training, every second, spent preparing for a moment like this, disappeared. Troy saw it in his eyes. The hesitation, the doubt, the uncertainty that hadn't fully left him yet. And so he struck again. Not with a slap this time, but with a fist. The punch came fast. And this time, Jay wasn't quick enough to move. It caught him clean across the jaw, sending a jolt of pain through his skull. His vision blurring for a second as he staggered, losing his footing. Before he could recover, Troy was on him, driving him backward, fists swinging, feeding off the momentum, the laughter, the approval of the crowd. Jay tried to swing back, but Troy was stronger, heavier. And before he knew it, his back hit the pavement, the world spinning for a moment before a knee pressed against his chest, pinning him in place. Troy's breath was uneven, his face flushed with exertion, but his grin never wavered. "You're pathetic," he murmured, just loud enough for Jay to hear. Jay tried to shove him off, but Troy didn't budge. The crowd leaned in, murmuring, waiting. Some entertained, others shifting uncomfortably, but no one stepped in. And then, just when Jay thought it was over, just when he thought Troy would finally back off, he felt the slow, deliberate weight of spit landing on his cheek. The laughter that followed was deafening. Troy finally pushed himself up, stepping back, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Stay down, Jay," he called over his shoulder as he turned away, his friends falling in beside him, the group dispersing as if nothing had happened. "You always do." Jay didn't move, not immediately. His cheeks stung, his ribs ached. His pride was gone. He could still hear them laughing, still feel the weight of every eye that had watched him fall and done nothing. For a long moment, he simply lay there, staring up at the sky, the world blurred around the edges, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Then, slowly, shakily, he pushed himself up. He didn't say anything, didn't look at anyone. He just walked away. And when he finally got home that night, his father took one look at him, at the swollen bruise forming along his jaw, the cut on his lip, the stiffness in his movements. And for the first time, David Collins understood. The air in the Collins household was heavier than usual that night, not with words, but with silence. Thick and weighted, settling between father and son like an unspoken understanding neither had dared to acknowledge until now. Jay sat at the dining table, untouched food in front of him. His movements slow, methodical, as he pushed a fork idly against his plate, his mind distant, replaying every second of that afternoon's humiliation in the parking lot, every fist, every shove, every piece of laughter that had cut deeper than Troy's blows ever could. Across from him, David Collins watched. He had noticed the shift in Jay for weeks, the tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed quieter, more withdrawn. But now, staring at the bruises forming along his jaw, the split in his lower lip, the dullness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, there was no need to ask. Something was wrong. He already knew the answer. What he didn't know was why his son had chosen to keep this from him. A long moment passed before David finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, steady, in the way a man's voice could only be after spending a lifetime controlling it. "Tell me what's happening at that school." "Hell." Jay's grip tightened slightly around his fork, his eyes dropping to his plate. "Nothing," he muttered. David leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, gaze unwavering. "Try again." Jay exhaled, sharp and frustrated, pushing his plate away as he sat back in his chair. "It doesn't matter." David's brow lifted slightly. "Doesn't matter?" His voice didn't rise. But there was something in it now, something firm, something unyielding. "You come home looking like that and expect me to believe it doesn't matter?" Jay's jaw clenched, but still he said nothing. His father studied him for a moment longer before shaking his head, sitting back. "You think I don't know what this is?" He motioned toward him, toward the bruises, the exhaustion, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You think I haven't been where you are?" Jay's gaze flickered up, just for a second. David let out a breath, slow and deliberate, before leaning forward again, folding his hands together. "You ever hear the story about how I got my first promotion?" Jay didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. "I was 23, fresh out of Ranger School, just made it into the unit." David continued, his voice steady, the weight of memory settling into his tone. "New guys, we were always tested, pushed around, not in any way that left a mark, but we knew what it was. They wanted to see what we were made of." He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "One guy, Staff Sergeant Haynes, he made it his personal mission to remind me every day that I wasn't one of them yet. Every mistake, he made sure everyone knew about it. Every small victory, he made sure it didn't mean a damn thing." Jay listened, his expression unreadable, but David could see the way his son's shoulders tensed, the way he leaned in just slightly. "One night," David continued, "we were on a training exercise. High stakes, high pressure. I nailed my role perfectly. Should have been a win. Instead, Haynes made a scene, tore me down in front of the others, called me a liability, a mistake, tried to make me believe it." He paused, then exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "And I almost did. Almost let him make me doubt myself. Almost accepted that I was the one who needed to back down." Jay swallowed but still didn't speak. David's eyes locked onto his son's. "You know what I did?" Jay hesitated before shaking his head. David's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, something sharper, something raw. "I put him on the ground." A flicker of something crossed Jay's face. Not just surprise, but something deeper. David leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "I waited. I trained harder, pushed myself past every limit I thought I had. And when the time came, when it really mattered, I put him down in front of everyone. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I was angry, but because I had to. Because if I didn't, if I let him take that from me, it would have never stopped." The room was silent, Then finally, David spoke again. "That's what you have to do." Jay's throat felt tight. "It's different," he muttered. "You don't get it." David's gaze didn't waver. "I don't?" Jay hesitated, then let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "You were a soldier in a unit. You had a mission. I'm just a kid in some school dealing with an idiot. You think a bully's any different just because he wears a different uniform?" David cut in, his voice quiet but firm. "You think the rules change just because the battlefield looks different?" Jay didn't have an answer for that. His father leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his expression hard but not unkind. "They're all the same. Men like Haynes, men like Troy. They push because they want to see you fall, and when you don't, when you take it and never push back, it tells them they can keep going." Jay stared at him. His father's expression didn't change. "That's why I'm going to train you," David said simply, "and I mean really train you. No more hitting a bag to work out your frustration. No more just throwing punches in the garage. You are going to learn how to fight, how to win. You're going to learn what it means to take power back." Jay felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. "And what happens when I do?" David met his eyes, his voice absolute. "Then you finish it." The words settled between them. Final, undeniable. Jay inhaled slowly. Something shifted inside him, something that felt like certainty, like the last piece falling into place. He nodded once. His father nodded back. And just like that, the training truly began. The morning started earlier now. The nights stretched longer. The weight on Jay's shoulders, once just the burden of silence and humiliation, had shifted into something tangible, something that burned in his muscles, settled in his bones, pushed him forward when exhaustion clawed at him. His father was relentless. There were no shortcuts, no easy lessons, only discipline, only sweat, only pain. The first morning of training, Jay had expected to step into the garage, throw a few punches at the bag, maybe some drills. But that wasn't how David Collins trained soldiers, and it wasn't how he was going to train his son. Instead, his father had pointed to the door. "Run!" he had said, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Jay had frowned. "How far?" David's answer had been simple. "Until I say stop." And so he had run. At first, it had been easy. His legs carried him effortlessly. His breath came steady. But as the minutes stretched into miles, as the cold morning air clawed at his lungs, as his body started screaming for him to slow down, he had begun to understand. This wasn't about speed. It wasn't about endurance. It was about breaking the part of him that wanted to quit before it even began. He had pushed until his legs trembled, until his throat was raw with gasped breaths. And when he had finally stopped, when he had turned back, expecting to see his father waiting with approval, David had just stared at him, eyes sharp, unreadable. "You done?" Jay had wiped sweat from his brow, his breathing uneven. Then, gritting his teeth, he had shaken his head. David had nodded. "Good, keep going." And that had been the first day. The same pattern continued the next morning, and the one after that. Each day began the same way, running before the sun had fully risen, pushing his body past what it thought was possible, learning that exhaustion wasn't an excuse, but a state of mind that could be ignored, controlled, defeated. After the runs came the drills. His father didn't waste time on complicated movements, never let him indulge in flashy combinations meant to impress. Every strike had a purpose. Every movement had a reason. "Speed doesn't mean a damn thing if your footing is wrong," David had told him, voice even, watching like a predator watching its cub learn to hunt. "You don't need 10 punches. You need one that counts." Jay had listened. He had learned. And then, after hours of relentless practice, came the sparring. The first time they stepped onto the mat in the garage, Jay had expected to feel some level of control, some small sense of preparedness after everything he had learned. But the first hit came faster than he expected. a sharp jab to the ribs before he had even fully settled into his stance. He had stumbled, gasping, instinctively raising his hands to block. But his father was already moving, a strike to the side, another to the gut. Not enough to injure, not enough to cause real damage, but enough to drive home a single, undeniable truth. He wasn't ready. "You think this is about anger?" David had asked, stepping back, watching as Jay struggled to catch his breath. "You think this is about standing there and throwing wild punches?" Jay had wiped blood from his lip, breathing hard. David had shaken his head. "This is about control. It's about knowing exactly when to hit and making sure it's the last one you need." He had gestured for Jay to get up, his voice steady, unrelenting. Again. And so, every day, they had gone again. Jay got faster. Jay got stronger. But more than anything, Jay learned. The punches that had once sent him staggering now barely knocked him off balance. His father still hit hard, still tested him, but Jay's body moved differently now, instinctively, precisely, like he wasn't just reacting, but predicting. One evening, as they squared off again, something changed. Jay ducked at the right moment, pivoted on instinct, and landed a sharp, clean strike to his father's ribs before he could counter. David had taken a step back, nodding slightly, rubbing his side where the hit had landed. For the first time, his father grinned. "Now you're thinking," he had said, the closest thing to praise he had ever given. Jay had smirked, rolling his shoulders, for the first time, actually feeling ready. But outside of that garage, outside of the sweat, the training, and the bruises, Rockford High hadn't changed. If anything, the bullying had only grown worse. Troy wasn't an idiot. He could sense something was different. Maybe it was the way Jay didn't flinch anymore when he approached. The way he held his ground instead of backing away. The way the usual insults and shoves didn't land the way they used to. Troy wasn't used to not getting a reaction, and it infuriated him, so he escalated. Jay's locker was trashed twice. His books were knocked from his hands more times than he could count. One day in the cafeteria, Troy had grabbed his tray right out of his hands, smirking as he dumped the food onto the floor. "Pick it up, boy," he sneered, voice dripping with mockery. Jay had just stared at him. His hands clenched at his sides, his pulse hammered, every fiber of his being screamed for him to react. But he didn't. Not yet. Because he was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the moment his father had told him about. Waiting for the moment where there would be no teachers, no crowd of friends backing Troy up, no distractions. Waiting for the moment where he could finish it. And that moment was coming. For weeks, he had felt it building. A quiet, simmering tension. A storm forming at the edges of every school day. He had seen it in the way Troy had watched him, the way his usual taunts had become sharper, the way the frustration had begun bleeding through the cracks in his cocky smirk every time Jay refused to give him the reaction he wanted. Troy wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to seeing someone he had knocked down get back up without fear in their eyes. And so Jay had waited. He endured the shoves, the insults, the humiliation Troy threw at him in a desperate attempt to force him back into place. He ignored the voices in the cafeteria, the laughter in the hallways, the food knocked from his hands, because he wasn't just looking for payback. He wasn't looking for revenge in a crowded hallway or in front of an audience of whispering students. He was looking for the moment when Troy would be alone, and when that moment finally arrived, Jay didn't hesitate. The school parking lot was nearly empty when Jay stepped outside that afternoon. The late-day sun cast long shadows across the pavement, the last few students filtering into their cars, lost in their own conversations, their own worlds. He had been expecting it. Today had felt different. The second he had locked eyes with Troy in class, had seen the way the other boy looked at him, like something had already been decided. And now, as he turned the corner behind the school, he wasn't surprised to see Troy already there. Leaning against the back wall near the maintenance shed, arms crossed, waiting. No crowd, no backup, just him. For the first time, Jay didn't slow, didn't stop, didn't change his pace as he approached. His heart steady, his body already ready. Troy pushed off the wall, that familiar smirk curling at the edges of his mouth. But there was something underneath it now, something different. "Been waiting for you, Jay," he said, his voice casual. Too casual. Jay stopped a few feet away, meeting his gaze, saying nothing. Troy tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You've been acting different lately." His voice was still light, but there was a sharpness in it now, something colder. "Walking around like you don't know your place anymore. Like you've forgotten who I am." Jay exhaled slowly. "I know exactly who you are." Troy's smirk widened. "Yeah? Then you should know what happens next." Jay did know. He had always known. And this time, he was ready. Troy moved first. It was fast, faster than Jay had expected, but not faster than he could react. The punch came wide, telegraphed, the same mistake Troy had made during their first fight in the parking lot. Jay didn't move back. He didn't flinch. He stepped into it. His left hand snapped up, deflecting the punch midair, redirecting the momentum. Troy barely had time to register the shift before Jay countered. A sharp strike to the ribs. Fast, controlled, precise. Troy staggered back, breath hitching, shock flashing across his face. Jay didn't wait. He advanced. A quick step forward. A controlled combination. A jab, a hook, a strike that clipped Troy's jaw just enough to send him stumbling. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't wild. It was measured, calculated. Troy regained his footing, his expression twisting with fury. "You think—" He barely got the words out before he lunged again, his movements sloppier now, his anger bleeding into his form. Jay didn't fall for it. He sidestepped, let Troy's own momentum work against him. His footwork was solid now, his stance unshakable, his body moving on instinct. Troy swung again, desperate now. But Jay was already inside his space, already seeing the opening before it happened. And this time, he didn't hold back. A final strike, clean, direct, undeniable. It connected with Troy's gut, knocking the air from his lungs. His knees buckled, and before he could regain control, Jay was on him, driving him backward, forcing him off balance, pinning him against the brick wall. The fight was over. Troy knew it. Jay could see it in his eyes. The sudden realization that the balance had shifted, that he wasn't the one in control anymore. For years, Troy had tormented him, beaten him, humiliated him. Had built his own image off the idea that Jay would never fight back, that he would always stay down, that he would always be someone to laugh at, to push around. Not anymore. Jay leaned in slightly, his voice calm. Steady, final. "You're done." Troy swallowed hard but said nothing. Jay held his gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of it settle. Then finally, he stepped back. Troy stayed against the wall for a second longer, breathing hard, eyes darting away. And then, without another word, he turned and ran. Jay watched him go, heart still steady, breath still even. He could feel the ache in his knuckles, the bruises already forming along his ribs. But none of it mattered, because this time, he hadn't lost. This time, Troy had been the one to walk away. The walk home felt different. The world wasn't any quieter, wasn't any brighter. And yet something had shifted. The weight that had sat in Jay's chest for so long, pressing against his ribs, making every breath feel heavy, was gone. Not just lifted, gone. He could still feel the ache in his knuckles, the dull sting in his ribs where Troy had landed a hit before everything had turned against him, but none of it mattered. Because for the first time, he had won. Not just a fight, not just some scrap behind the school. He had won himself back. Troy wasn't untouchable anymore. He wasn't the force he had spent years convincing everyone he was. He had swung, he had fought, and he had lost. That changed everything. The thought carried Jay all the way to his doorstep. The familiar scent of home drifted into his lungs the second he stepped inside. The hum of the television in the background, the faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Everything felt the same. But Jay knew he wasn't walking into this house the same way he had yesterday. His father was in the living room, his usual place on the couch, a bottle of water in one hand, remote in the other, flipping through the channels without much interest. He didn't look up immediately. Didn't ask anything the second Jay walked through the door. But Jay knew he had already seen. It was in the slight shift of his shoulders, the way his grip on the remote paused just for a second, before he finally turned his head, eyes locking onto his son. And just like that, David Collins knew. He set the remote down, exhaling through his nose. "You did it." Jay let out a breath, nodding slowly. "I did it." For a second, neither of them said anything. Then, just like that, David laughed, too. A sharp, genuine sound that barely ever made its way past his lips. A sound Jay had heard so rarely it almost startled him. But there it was. Pride. Real, unfiltered pride. His father pushed himself up from the couch, stepping forward, pressing a firm hand against Jay's shoulder, giving it a shake. "Damn right you did." Jay hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear that. The tension that had still been lingering in his chest, the last traces of doubt, of wondering if this victory had truly meant something, all of it disappeared under the weight of those words. Under the solid grip of his father's hand, the silent acknowledgement that everything he had gone through, everything he had endured, had led to this moment. For the first time, he wasn't just David Collins's son. He was a fighter in his own right. David gave his shoulder one last shake before stepping back, exhaling. "Tell me everything." And so Jay did. Every detail. Every moment. The way Troy had looked at him before the fight. The way his fists had finally moved without hesitation, without fear. The way Troy had backed down, had walked away knowing he had lost. Every second of it mattered, because every second of it had been a moment where Jay had taken something back. David listened, arms crossed, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. Though Jay could still see the small traces of pride behind his eyes, but when Jay finally finished, when he let out a breath, waiting for his father's reaction, David's expression shifted. The pride didn't disappear, but something else settled in its place. A different kind of knowing, a different kind of lesson. "You're feeling good right now," David said finally, stepping back, moving toward the kitchen where a half-full glass of water sat on the counter. He grabbed it, taking a sip before looking back at Jay. "And you should. You earned it." Jay nodded, but his father wasn't done. "But understand something," David continued, setting the glass down. "That fight doesn't end just because you won." His eyes darkened slightly, his voice dipping into something lower, something more serious. "You put him in his place. But people like him, they don't forget that. And they don't take losing lightly." Jay felt something cold slip down his spine. He hadn't thought about that. "Not yet. Troy's pride isn't gone. It's just bruised," David said, watching his son closely. "And the worst thing you can do right now is let your guard down." Jay inhaled slowly. His father wasn't wrong. He had seen it in Troy's eyes before he walked away. That burning, that silent rage that came with knowing your entire world had just shifted against you. Troy had lost today. But that didn't mean he was done. David must have seen the realization settle in, because he finally exhaled, stepping forward, placing both hands on Jay's shoulders. "This is where discipline matters," he said, voice steady. "You fought for your respect. You fought for your place. Now, you protect it." Jay swallowed, nodding slowly. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something bigger. His father squeezed his shoulders one last time before letting go, stepping back. "Now," David said, smirking slightly, the weight of the conversation lifting just enough for the moment to breathe again, I think this calls for a celebration. Jay raised a brow. Celebration? David motioned toward the kitchen, already moving toward the cabinets. You think I'd let my son go through all that training just to come home and eat whatever we got in the fridge? Hell no! I'm making steaks. Jay blinked. Wait, you actually cook? David shot him a look. I can make a damn steak, Jay. Don't insult me. Jay smirked, shaking his head. The weight in his chest finally settling into something like victory. Victory tasted good. But just as he was about to help set up, just as the moment had begun to truly feel like something worth holding on to, there was a sharp, heavy pounding at the front door. The entire atmosphere shifted. David stilled. Jay turned toward the entrance, the sound echoing through the house, shaking the walls. The kind of knock that wasn't a request, but a demand. His father exhaled slowly, cracking his neck, rolling his shoulders back, like a man who already knew exactly what was waiting for him on the other side. And just like that, Jay knew too. Troy hadn't forgotten. David walked toward the door, steps calm, controlled, deliberate. Jay felt his pulse pick up. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was something else, something sharper, something that whispered this fight wasn't over. Not yet. The pounding at the door came again, harder this time, each impact rattling the frame, sending a deep, vibrating pulse through the quiet of the house. Jay stood frozen for a brief moment, the weight of everything settling in all at once. The fight, the victory, the warning his father had just given him. This wasn't over. David Collins exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back, straightening his stance, preparing. There was no hesitation in his steps as he moved toward the door, no uncertainty in the way his hand gripped the knob, no moment of pause before he yanked it open, revealing exactly what he had been expecting. Robert Roberts. The man stood on the doorstep, broad and imposing, his features contorted with something between anger and barely controlled rage. His light blue button-up was wrinkled, the sleeves pushed to his elbows as if he had stormed out of his house in a hurry. His fists clenched and unclenched at his sides, his eyes cold, sharp, filled with the same condescension and entitlement his son carried. Locked onto David's, the door swung open. There was a pause, a long, heavy silence where the air itself thickened between them, both men sizing the other up in an instant. Then Robert let out a sharp breath, shaking his head slightly, his lips curling in a sneer. You've got some nerve. David didn't move, didn't blink. You're standing on my doorstep, pounding on my door like you're about to issue a warrant. So how about you just say what you came here to say, and get to the point? Robert's expression darkened. You know exactly why I'm here. David lifted a brow, arms crossing over his chest. But I have a feeling you're about to tell me. Robert took a step forward, invasive, posturing, puffing up his chest like the sheer weight of his presence was supposed to do something. Your son put his hands on my boy today, left him bleeding, bruised. My kid walks through this town with my name, and now people are whispering like he's some kind of... His voice cut off, his jaw clenching. You think I'm going to let that slide? David didn't flinch. He had seen this kind of man 1,000 times before, the kind who mistook privilege for power, the kind who believed respect was something they were owed instead of something they had to earn, the kind who had never had to answer for their actions, who had never once been held accountable because the world had always let them believe they were untouchable. And he could see, clear as day, that Robert's anger had nothing to do with his son being hurt. It had to do with the fact that his son had lost. David exhaled, slow and measured, shaking his head slightly. Let me guess, he said, voice calm, unreadable. Troy told you he was minding his own business, that Jay just came out of nowhere and attacked him, and you believed it? That about right? Robert scoffed. You calling my kid a liar? David's lips twitched, something cold passing through his eyes. I'm calling him your kid. Robert's hands clenched at his sides. Say that again. David took a step forward now, closing the distance between them, his expression unwavering. I said your son is a liar. He has been since the day he learned he could get away with it. Robert's face twisted. But before he could speak, before he could launch into whatever self-righteous tirade he had been rehearsing on the drive over, David kept going. My son's been coming home with bruises for months, and I let it go. I let it go because I wanted him to learn how to pick his battles. Wanted him to understand that some things aren't worth the fight. But Troy didn't stop, because kids like him never stop. Not until they realize they aren't the biggest dog in the yard. So he pushed, and he pushed. And then today, he got what was coming to him. David's voice never wavered, never rose. But there was something lethal buried beneath every word. And now you're standing here at my door, trying to turn this into something it isn't, trying to pretend like your son is the victim. Robert let out a bitter, humorless laugh, shaking his head. You people are unbelievable. And there it was. Jay felt his stomach tighten, felt his fists clench at his sides. But his father didn't react, didn't even blink, as if he had already been expecting it. You act like you're better than us, Robert continued, his voice laced with venom, his posture shifting as his anger took on a new edge. Like you don't know your place. Like you're not standing in a house you shouldn't even own, in a neighborhood you don't belong in, raising a son who... David moved. It was fast, so fast that, for a split second, Robert actually flinched, his body stiffening as if preparing for something physical. But David didn't lay a hand on him, didn't raise his fists, didn't react with anything but cold, unshakable restraint. Instead, he simply stepped forward. Just enough that Robert had no choice but to take a step back. Just enough that the shift in power was immediate, undeniable. You want to talk about places? David's voice was low now, deadly quiet. Then listen real close, because I want to make sure you hear me, Roberts. My son is not beneath yours. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And the only reason I'm still standing here having this conversation, instead of handling this the way men like you actually deserve, is because I want to make sure you understand something real clear. The next time your son tries this, the next time he lays a hand on my kid, I won't be the one holding him back. Ivan, Robert's face twisted into something unreadable. For the first time, he looked unsure. David held his gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of his words settle. Then finally, he took a step back, exhaling sharply. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got dinner to finish. And with that, he slammed the door in Robert Roberts's face. The silence that followed was thick, charged with the kind of tension that didn't just dissolve. David could still feel it in his chest as he stepped back toward the kitchen, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake off the weight of the confrontation that had just taken place. He had dealt with men like Robert Roberts before. Men who had never been told no, who had never lost, who carried their superiority like armor until the moment it was stripped away. But this wasn't over. Jay could feel it too. The way his father's movements were precise, measured, but his jaw was still clenched, his hands flexing at his sides. There was something unfinished lingering in the air, something waiting to explode. And then the pounding started again. This time, it wasn't just a knock. It was violent, erratic, a fist slamming against wood over and over, sending deep, shaking echoes through the house. Then came the voice, raw, ragged with fury, all pretense of composure gone. "Open the damn door, Collins!" Jay tensed instantly, his stomach knotting, his body still on edge from everything that had happened just minutes before. He turned, his eyes flickering toward his father, expecting him to hesitate, to think through the situation before making a move. But David was already moving. His steps were calm, controlled, but unyielding as he made his way toward the door, not even pausing before yanking it open. And there was Robert Roberts. His face flushed red with fury, his breath coming fast, his fists still clenched at his sides. Whatever restraint he had been clinging to before, whatever polished self-control he had walked up to this house with the first time, it was gone now. "You think you can slam the door in my face?" Robert spat, his voice hoarse, eyes wild. "You think you can stand there and talk down to me like I'm just some—" David tilted his head slightly, watching him with a kind of detached amusement. Robert's hands twitched, like they wanted to move but weren't sure how to. His breaths were sharp and uneven, his chest rising and falling fast, his body vibrating with unchecked rage. "I've had enough of your mouth," he growled. David exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "And yet here you are, still running yours." That was it. That was all it took. Robert lunged. The movement was fast, but not fast enough. His hands barely made it past David's chest before he was stopped cold. A single sharp motion cut through his momentum like it was nothing. David's arms snapped forward, his grip latching onto Robert's wrist, twisting it just enough to send a shockwave of pain through his joints without actually breaking anything. Robert let out a choked sound, stumbling forward, thrown off balance. And that was the first mistake. David could have ended it right there. Could have snapped his wrist, shoved him back, thrown him to the ground with the same efficiency he had used on men twice his size during combat deployments. But he didn't, because this wasn't just about winning, this was about teaching. Robert recovered, yanking his arm back, his fury doubling as he threw a wild, uncalculated punch. But David saw it coming long before it was thrown. He shifted, weaving around it so smoothly that it almost looked like slow motion. His body barely moving as the strike sailed past him and hit nothing but air. And then David stepped in. One solid push to Robert's chest sent him stumbling back, his feet scrambling against the pavement. The first burst of laughter came from the sidewalk. Robert froze, his head snapping toward the source. Neighbors. People had started gathering, some standing in their driveways, others pulling out their phones, recording. Robert's face twisted. David smirked. "Didn't think this one through, did you?" Robert's jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. And then, like a cornered animal, he charged. His body slammed forward, all power, no precision. He wasn't thinking. He wasn't strategizing. He was furious, humiliated, desperate to reclaim control. David didn't even move at first, didn't shift until the exact moment the weight of Robert's body was fully committed. And then he pivoted. A sharp twist, a clean motion. And in an instant, Robert's entire body was redirected, his own weight betraying him. 1 second he was charging, the next he was on his knees, his arm locked in an iron-tight hold, his body completely restrained. A headlock, clean, effortless, unbreakable. Robert struggled, gasping, his face turning red, his hands clawing uselessly at David's forearm. But it was no use. The laughter grew. People were watching, recording. And that was when reality set in. Robert, once the man with all the control, the man who had pounded on this door expecting to be feared, to be respected, to be obeyed, was now the spectacle. The pathetic, writhing fool on the pavement, gasping for breath while the man he had come to intimidate barely looked winded. David leaned in slightly, his voice low, calm, only for Robert to hear. "You should have walked away." Robert stopped struggling. David let the moment stretch just long enough for Robert to fully understand what had just happened, long enough for the weight of the humiliation to settle deep in his gut. Then finally, he released him. Robert collapsed onto the pavement, coughing, breathless, his body shaking with adrenaline, fury, and shame. His eyes darted up, taking in the phones pointed at him, the quiet murmurs, the chuckles, the whispers of disbelief. And for the first time, he didn't have anything to say. David exhaled, rolling his shoulders, adjusting his stance. "Are we done here?" Robert didn't answer, didn't move, didn't even look at him. David smirked. "That's what I thought." And without another word, he turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind him. Jay let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His father said nothing at first, just rolled his neck, his posture completely relaxed, as if he hadn't just dismantled a grown man in front of the entire neighborhood. Then he looked at Jay, tilting his head slightly. "Go ahead and eat," he said, voice casual. "Steak's probably cold by now." Jay blinked, staring, and then he laughed. The air at Rockford High was different. It wasn't obvious at first, not in a way that most people would consciously acknowledge. But Jay felt it the second he stepped through the doors. The subtle shift in the way conversations paused just slightly when he walked past. The way heads turned toward him more than usual. The way eyes that had once barely acknowledged his existence lingered. Something had changed. The whispers followed him down the hall. Low, hushed voices. Laughter in the distance. Murmured phrases. Just quiet enough that he couldn't catch them, but loud enough that he knew exactly what they were about. He had expected this, had known that the fight with Troy wouldn't just disappear. But as he passed a group of juniors near the lockers, one of them barely concealing a grin as he nudged his friend and whispered something, Jay realized they weren't laughing at him anymore. They were laughing at Troy. The weight of that realization settled deep in his chest. Slow and steady, stretching through his body like a long exhale after holding his breath for too long. For so long, this school had felt like something he had to navigate carefully, like every step was meant to keep him from slipping into the crosshairs. Now, it didn't feel like that anymore. And then it happened. At first, it was subtle. A casual nod from a guy he had never spoken to before. "Yo, that was wild, man," from someone who had never so much as looked in his direction before today. Then, in second period, a girl named Lauren Clark, one of the more well-known students, not quite at the top of the school's social hierarchy, but high enough that people paid attention to her, turned to him just before class started. "So, is it true?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Jay frowned. "Is what true?" Lauren smirked. "That you knocked Troy on his butt so hard his dad had to come crying into your house about it." A few people around them laughed under their breath, pretending not to listen, but definitely listening. Jay exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Something like that." Lauren's smirk widened. "About damn time." Jay raised a brow, glancing at her. "You don't like Troy?" Lauren scoffed. "Nobody likes Troy. People just tolerate him because of who his dad is." "Hem." Jay blinked, something clicking in his mind. It wasn't that people had been blind to Troy's behavior all these years. It was that they had been too scared to do anything about it. Now, they weren't. Lauren leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Word is, his dad got handled even worse than he did." Jay smirked, shaking his head. "I wouldn't know anything about that." Lauren grinned. "Sure, who?" She turned back in her seat just as the teacher entered, but not before adding, "You should sit with us at lunch." Jay barely had time to process that before the lesson began, but even as the teacher started speaking, he could feel the eyes on him. The shift in perception. For the first time, people weren't looking at him like a victim. They were looking at him like someone who had changed the game. By the time lunch rolled around, the shift in energy had only grown stronger. The moment Jay stepped into the cafeteria, he could feel it. The low hum of curiosity, the way conversations subtly redirected toward him. This time, when he grabbed his tray, nobody knocked it out of his hands. Lauren waved him over to a table near the center of the room, where she was sitting with a small group of students, most of whom he recognized but had never spoken to before. For the first time, he wasn't walking toward an empty table. The moment he sat down, someone else leaned in. Dean Turner, a senior, wide-shouldered, one of the football guys, but not the obnoxious type. "You really took down Troy?" Dean asked, resting his arms on the table. Jay took a bite of his food, chewing slowly before answering. "Yeah." Dean let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Man, I wish I could have seen it. That guy's been running his mouth since freshman year." "Yeah," another guy chimed in. "Nobody's ever put him in his place like that before." Jay exhaled, shaking his head. "It wasn't about that." Dean raised a brow. "Then what was it about?" Jay thought about that for a moment, then shrugged. "It was about making sure he never did it again." Dean nodded, seeming to accept that answer. "Well, either way, man, respect." He raised his fist, and without thinking, Jay bumped it. Something so small, so insignificant to anyone else, But to him, it felt like something he had never had before. He wasn't just being tolerated anymore, he was being included. And then the moment shifted, because across the cafeteria, standing just near the entrance, was Troy. His face was still bruised, the fading shades of purple and yellow lining his jaw. But that wasn't what caught Jay's attention. It was his eyes. For the first time, Troy wasn't looking at him with arrogance. He wasn't smirking, wasn't making his way over with his usual bravado, wasn't cracking his knuckles like he had something to prove. He was just standing there, watching, silent. There was something different in his face now. A realization, a hesitation, a moment of reckoning, where he finally understood that nothing would ever be the same. Jay held his gaze, calm, unbothered, meeting him with a look that said everything without saying anything at all. Troy didn't move, didn't speak, and then finally, he looked away, turned around, walked out of the cafeteria. Jay exhaled slowly, his hands relaxing at his sides. The email arrived that evening. Jay had been sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone, a small smirk tugging at the edges of his lips as he skimmed through a group chat that had started circulating around Rockford High. A thread filled with jokes about Troy's downfall, about how the school had needed someone to knock him down a peg for years. And now, finally, someone had done it. It was surreal, seeing his name pop up in messages that weren't insults, weren't attached to some joke at his expense. This was different. This was respect. And then, from the kitchen, his father's voice cut through the air. "Jay, come here." Something in his tone sent a chill through his spine. Jay stood quickly, pushing off the couch and making his way into the kitchen, where David was seated at the table, laptop open in front of him, his expression unreadable, the glow of the screen casting sharp shadows against his face, his jaw tight, the faint flicker of restrained anger behind his eyes. Jay stepped closer. "What is it?" David didn't look up at first, just let out a slow, controlled breath before turning the screen slightly so Jay could see. And there it was, an official notice from the Rockford High School board. The words stood out in bold professional type. "Urgent emergency hearing regarding student conduct. Jay Collins." His stomach dropped. "They're calling a hearing?" he asked, his voice even, but his heart hammering against his ribs. David's jaw ticked. "Not just a hearing," he said, his voice calm, measured in a way that told Jay he was already fighting back a storm of anger. "They're calling for your expulsion." Jay inhaled sharply, but he shouldn't have been surprised. He should have seen this coming. This wasn't about the fight. This was Robert. Pulling strings, making calls, twisting the system to work in his favor. The way men like him always did. The way they always had. The way they always would, unless someone finally stopped them. Jay's hands clenched at his sides. He couldn't beat you, so now he's trying to do this instead. David exhaled slowly, nodding. "It was never about Troy," he murmured. "It was always about power, about control." Oh, his fingers tapped lightly against the table, his mind already working, already planning, already moving pieces the same way he had done 100 times before on a battlefield. Jay looked at the email again, his throat tightening at the way it was worded. Cold, procedural, as if what they were talking about was some minor disciplinary matter rather than a deliberate attempt to destroy his future. "This is insane," Jay muttered, shaking his head. "They have to know he started it. They have to know." "They don't care," David cut in, his voice sharp but not unkind. "Robert isn't playing fair. He never was. He doesn't need the truth. He just needs enough leverage to make it look like he's right." Jay swallowed hard, his stomach twisting. His father leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "The hearing's in 2 days," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "That's all the time we have to prepare." Jay looked at him, waiting. For direction. For the plan. For whatever strategy David had already formed in his mind, But instead, his father exhaled slowly and met his gaze. "You up for this?" Jay let the silence stretch. Let the question settle deep in his chest. Let the weight of everything press down on him all at once. Then slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I'm ready." The boardroom wasn't designed for tension, but the air inside was thick with it. A polished wooden table sat in the center of the room, lined with school board members, their faces a mixture of indifference, authority, and quiet curiosity. Principal Howard sat at the end, hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression carefully neutral. Jay sat beside his father on one side of the table. Robert and Troy sat on the other. Jay could feel Troy's eyes on him, but he didn't look back. Because it wasn't about him anymore. Robert, however, wasn't hiding his smugness. He leaned back slightly in his chair, arms crossed, his mouth curled into the faintest smirk. His entire posture screamed confidence, certainty, the assurance of a man who had spent his entire life bending the system in his favor. Jay could see it now. He expected to win, expected the board to side with him, expected them to nod along, agree with his carefully crafted narrative, expected this to end with Jay walking out of here with nothing but a bag full of regrets and an expulsion notice. And then the board president cleared his throat. "This hearing is now in session," he announced, straightening his tie. "Mr. Roberts, since you initiated this process, you may present your case first." Robert leaned forward, his smirk growing. "Thank you," he said smoothly, his voice measured, practiced, like he had already won. And then, with a single breath, he launched into his performance. A twisted version of the truth, carefully curated. How his son had been attacked without provocation. How Jay had instigated the fight. How the school had allowed an aggressive student to target and assault his son while doing nothing to protect him. He spoke about safety, responsibility, discipline. Every word was perfectly crafted, expertly spun, tailored to appeal to the right ears, the right biases, the right authority figures. By the time he finished, a heavy silence hung over the room. And then David Collins spoke. "Number." The single word was calm, unshaken, cutting through the silence with the weight of something immovable. Robert blinked. "Excuse me?" David leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "No," he repeated. His voice smooth, controlled, but carrying something beneath it that made the entire room feel smaller. "That's not what happened. And you know it." Robert's face twitched. David didn't give him the chance to recover. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and placed it on the table. With a single tap, the video played. The fight. The real fight. The one that had started with Troy throwing the first punch. The one that had ended with him on the ground. And then a second video. The footage of Robert himself, screaming, pounding on their door, throwing his fists at a man who never lifted a hand in return. The footage of him being humiliated in his own fight, caught in a headlock, gasping for air while the neighborhood watched. By the time the video stopped, the air was so thick it was suffocating. Robert's face had gone pale, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. And when David spoke again, his voice was calm, steady, final. "The only violent people in this room," he said, eyes locked onto Robert's, "are sitting on that side of the table." The board members shifted. The principal cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable. The room was silent. Not just quiet, silent. Not the kind of silence that came from decorum or professionalism. Not the silence of respect. Number. This was something else entirely. This was the silence of a man who had lost control. Robert Roberts sat rigid in his chair, his breath uneven, his face a shade paler than it had been just moments ago. His fingers still gripped the edges of the table, knuckles stark white against the polished wood. He had walked into this hearing expecting to win, expected to dominate the room the way he always did, expected to talk his way into getting what he wanted, expected the same unspoken privileges that had always worked in his favor. But now he was just another man backed into a corner, and the entire room knew it. No one spoke. Not the board members, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Not the principal, who was suddenly so focused on the papers in front of him, it looked like he was trying to will himself invisible. Not even Troy. Especially not Troy. The boy who had always been loud, smug, arrogant, dripping with the same untouchable attitude his father carried, now sat small, hunched. His head slightly lowered, his jaw clenched tight. He wasn't looking at anyone. Not at his father, not at Jay, not even at the board members whose decision could very well change his future. He knew what was coming, and so did everyone else. David Collins exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, completely composed. He had already won. The only thing left was letting them catch up to that fact. The school board president cleared his throat, shifting his weight in his chair. "Mr. Collins," he said finally, his voice tight, controlled, "how exactly did you obtain these videos?" David arched a brow, his expression unreadable. "Concerned about privacy now?" The president stiffened slightly, but David didn't wait for a response. He reached forward calmly, locking his phone and placing it flat on the table. "The fight video came from students," he said simply. "You might have noticed, but kids these days, they record everything." He gestured lightly toward Jay. Word got around fast. Plenty of them were happy to send me a copy. Jay had barely needed to ask. The second he walked into school that morning, his phone had been lighting up with messages. Some from people he barely even knew. Students who had watched the fight firsthand, who had recorded it from a distance, who had seen Troy go down and wanted to be the first to make sure it spread. The files had come flooding in. Multiple angles, multiple perspectives, undeniable proof that Troy had started the fight. And as for the other video, David smirked slightly. "The footage of our little doorstep conversation?" He shrugged. "Let's just say your tantrum was loud enough to draw a crowd." That part hadn't even been intentional. David had known the moment he put Robert in that headlock that word would spread, that people would talk, that there would be witnesses. But what he hadn't expected was the fact that half the neighborhood had recorded it. His phone had been buzzing all night with messages from neighbors, some amused, some impressed, some outright laughing, as they sent over clips taken from front porches, doorbell cameras, even one shaky recording from across the street where the audio had caught Robert's voice almost perfectly. David hadn't even asked for most of them. They had just come to him. Because Rockford, for all its silence over the years, for all its refusal to ever step in, had seen something change. And now, so had the school board. The president let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming lightly against the table, his gaze flicking toward Robert, whose face had gone so stiff it looked carved from stone. "Mr. Roberts," the president said, his voice firm, "do you have anything to say?" Robert's nostrils flared. His fingers twitched, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The board president nodded slightly, as if that was all he needed to hear, before turning his attention back to David. "Mr. Collins," he said, "based on the evidence presented today, and after reviewing the circumstances surrounding the incident, the board sees no reason to pursue disciplinary action against Jay Collins." Jay exhaled, slow and steady. There it was, the final word. David just nodded once. "Good." The president cleared his throat, turning toward Robert now. As for Troy Roberts, given his repeated disciplinary history and his involvement in this incident, we will be placing him on probationary suspension. Further, violations will result in expulsion. Robert jerked upright. "You can't be serious." "This hearing is now concluded." The president cut him off smoothly, already standing. The decision had been made, and Robert Roberts had officially lost. The board members rose, some already gathering their papers, not bothering to look at Robert as they filed out. The principal followed suit, his silence as damning as any ruling, and then it was just them. For a long moment, no one moved. Jay watched as Robert sat there, his entire body stiff, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, so hard it looked like he might snap them in half. Troy still hadn't looked up, and then, slowly, stiffly, Robert turned his head, his eyes locking onto David's. David just smirked. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence between them said it all. Finally, Robert stood. He moved like a man who had just been stripped of everything he had once held dear. A man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, only to find out in the worst possible way that he wasn't. He turned toward Troy, his voice clipped, sharp. "Let's go." Troy didn't argue, didn't say anything. Didn't even glance at Jay as he pushed back his chair and followed his father out of the room. Jay watched them go, watched as Robert stormed out the door without so much as looking back. And then, just like that, the air in the room suddenly felt lighter. Jay exhaled, turning toward his father. But David was already pushing himself up from his chair, rolling his shoulders, stretching slightly. "Well," David said casually, "that was fun." Jay let out a breath of laughter, shaking his head. And as they stepped out into the hallway, walking away from the room where justice had finally been served, Jay knew this wasn't just about a fight anymore. This was the moment everything changed. The night air was crisp, cool against Jay's skin as he stepped out of the steakhouse, his stomach full, the weight of everything that had happened finally beginning to settle into something real. He had thought it would feel different, thought that after all the fighting, the tension, the moments of doubt, there would be some massive wave of relief that crashed over him the second they walked out of that school board meeting. But instead, it felt quieter, more like a deep breath after holding it in for too long. David walked beside him, just as calm, just as measured, as they made their way across the lot toward the truck. He hadn't said much over dinner. Just let Jay talk. Let him breathe through the moment. Let him process the victory without the weight of a lesson attached to it. And now, as they reached the truck, David stretched his arms above his head, exhaling in satisfaction. "You realize what this means, right?" he said, glancing over at Jay with a smirk. Jay raised a brow. "What?" David nodded toward the restaurant behind them. "We just ate the best steak in town on Robert Roberts's failed vendetta. I gotta say, justice tastes good." Jay huffed a laugh, shaking his head as he climbed into the passenger seat. His father's humor had a way of sneaking up on him, dry, unexpected, but always perfectly timed. David started the truck, pulling out of the lot and onto the road, his fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was earned. The fight was over. The board had spoken. Troy had been put in his place. And Robert had been broken. But the thing about men like Robert was that they didn't just accept loss. Jay hadn't thought about it much. Not since leaving that boardroom. Not since watching Robert and Troy storm out, humiliated, defeated. But now, as the truck rumbled down the road, a feeling settled in the back of his mind. Something wasn't right. David must have felt it too. Because after a few minutes, his fingers stopped tapping against the wheel. His posture stiffened. His eyes flickered toward the rearview mirror. Watching, Jay noticed the shift immediately. "What?" he asked, straightening in his seat. David didn't answer at first, didn't take his eyes off the mirror, didn't break the stillness in his expression. But then, after a long moment, he exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "We're being followed." Jay's breath hitched, his spine going rigid. He turned his head slightly, trying not to be obvious as he glanced toward the mirror. There, a black SUV, dark windows, close enough to be noticed, far enough to pretend like it was just another car on the road. Jay swallowed. "How long?" David turned onto a side road, watching as the SUV turned with them. "Since we left the restaurant," he said simply. Jay's pulse picked up. "You think it's him?" David let out a humorless chuckle. "I'd bet tomorrow's paycheck on it." Jay's jaw clenched. "What do we do?" David sighed, rolling his shoulders back as if he had already made his decision long before Jay had even asked. We finish this. With that, he slowed the truck, pulling off to the side of the road. The SUV hesitated. Then slowly, it followed suit. The second the vehicles came to a stop, David opened his door, stepping out without an ounce of hesitation. His posture relaxed, but his presence unmistakably commanding. Jay followed, his body tense, his pulse hammering in his throat. As the doors of the SUV swung open, it revealed exactly what he expected: Robert Roberts. But this time, he wasn't alone. 3 other men climbed out with him, all built like they had spent their best years trying to look tougher than they actually were. Their expressions lined with the same entitlement, the same unchecked hatred that clung to Robert like a second skin. Jay didn't know their names. Didn't need to. He knew their type. Robert stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. But his face was something else entirely. The humiliation, the fury, the unchecked rage that had been building inside him ever since he lost. It was all there. Bare, open, ugly. In the way men like him became when they had nothing left to hold on to. "You got a lot of nerve, Collins," Robert said, his voice sharp, simmering. "Embarrassing me like that. In front of my son. In front of the whole damn town." David let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly. "Didn't need my help for that, Roberts. You did just fine, all on your own." Robert's eyes darkened. His fists twitched. One of the men beside him let out a quiet, low chuckle. "Man's got a mouth on him, huh?" David didn't even glance at them, didn't acknowledge them at all. His attention was locked onto Robert, unwavering. "I knew you'd come," David murmured, his voice smooth, unreadable. "Men like you always do." Robert sneered. "Men like me?" David exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You had to bring backup," he said, gesturing slightly toward the other men. "You needed to, didn't you? Couldn't handle me on your own. So now you're hoping numbers will change something." He took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto Robert's with something dark, something cold, something that said he had already sized up the entire situation and knew exactly how it was going to end. "Go on, Roberts," he said quietly. "Tell me how this is supposed to go." Robert's lips pressed into a thin line, but his fists clenched tighter. One of the other men scoffed, shaking his head. "Man, you gonna let him talk to you like that?" Robert barely moved, but Jay could see the moment he snapped. "Damn right I brought backup," Robert growled, stepping forward, his posture bulging with false confidence. "You think I was gonna let you make a fool out of me, out of my family, and just get away with it? You think you get to walk around like you own this town? Like you belong here?" David exhaled slowly, his expression never wavering. "I don't need to act like I belong here," he said evenly. "I already do." Robert's breath hitched. The night air was thick with tension, humming with the kind of energy that settled in the space just before violence erupted. Jay could feel it in his bones. His pulse was steady, controlled, his breath even. But his hands had already curled into fists, his instincts screaming that this moment, this exact moment, was where everything finally came to a head. He stood just a few steps behind his father. Close enough to move if needed, but not close enough to be a distraction. Not yet. His fingers hovered over his phone in his pocket, his mind flashing back to what had happened at the school board, to the way his father had turned the tide with undeniable evidence, to the way Robert had looked when he realized he had lost. Jay had a feeling tonight would need its own evidence. So slowly, subtly, he pulled out his phone and hit record. Robert's chest rose and fell with deep, erratic breaths, his body practically shaking with fury as he stood in front of them, flanked by his 3 friends. They weren't kids like Troy. They were men, older, heavier, meaner. Their presence alone was a message, a statement that this wasn't meant to be a fair fight. David Collins didn't look impressed. He tilted his head slightly, exhaling. His stance relaxed, his entire body loose but ready. He had seen men like this before, too confident, too reliant on strength, too blinded by their own egos to realize what they were stepping into. "You should have stayed home, Roberts," David said, his voice calm, measured, completely unshaken. Robert scoffed, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" He gestured to his men, his smirk widening as he squared his shoulders. "You think I was just going to let you humiliate me? Make a joke out of my family?" David arched a brow, unimpressed. "You did that all on your own." Robert's face twisted with rage. Then he lunged. And just like that, the fight began. The first punch came fast, wild, reckless, fueled by anger instead of strategy. David sidestepped it effortlessly, his body shifting just enough to let the momentum pass by harmlessly. Robert stumbled forward, off balance. Completely open, David struck fast, a clean, sharp jab straight to the ribs, knocking the air from Robert's lungs before he could even recover. But the others were already moving. One of Robert's men, a thick-necked guy with fists the size of bricks, rushed in next, swinging low. David pivoted, catching the arm mid-motion, twisting just enough to send him sprawling forward, face first into the dirt. The second man lunged faster, smarter, aiming high. This one was more controlled, his movements sharper. But David had spent his entire life reading fighters before they even threw their first punch. He stepped inside the attack, caught the incoming fist on his forearm, redirected the force, and sent a brutal knee straight into the man's gut. The sound of air rushing out of his lungs was audible even over the scuffle, his body doubling over in an instant. But it was still 3 against 1. The third man, seeing his opening, came at David from behind. Silent, quick, aiming for the blind spot. Jay didn't hesitate. He moved purely on instinct, stepping forward, his foot sweeping out in a clean, well-timed trip, knocking the man's legs out from under him just before he could reach his father. David didn't even turn. He had already felt the shift in movement, already sensed Jay's intervention, already anticipated the moment. The third man hit the ground with a grunt, his shoulders slamming into the pavement. Robert roared in frustration, lunging again, this time putting his full weight into a tackle. David let him come. He absorbed the impact, shifted his stance, and used the momentum against him, twisting Robert's body mid-motion, sending them both crashing down. But only one of them landed in control. By the time the dust settled, David was on top, one knee pressing against Robert's chest, his forearm digging against his throat, just enough to pin him, to immobilize him, to force him to feel the weight of his own loss. Robert struggled, his hands clawing at David's arm, his breath coming in short, gasping bursts. He was losing again. But this time there was no crowd to watch, no school board, no principal, no cameras rolling from the sidelines. Except for one. Jay stepped closer, his phone still raised, still recording, still capturing every humiliating second. David exhaled slowly, watching Robert's face twist with the slow, dawning realization that there was nothing left for him to do. "You done?" David asked, his voice low, calm, lethal in its certainty. Robert let out a choked half-snarl, his body still twitching with the last shreds of his fight. David pressed down slightly, just enough to remind him who was in control. "I said," David repeated, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Are you done?" Robert finally stilled, defeated. David held him there a second longer, long enough to let the weight of it settle. Then finally, he released the pressure, standing slowly, letting Robert gasp for air as he rolled onto his side, coughing, shaking. The other 3 men were still down, still groaning, still too winded or too afraid to move. Jay lowered his phone slightly, taking a slow step forward, his gaze locking onto Robert's as he struggled to sit up. "Here's how this is going to work," Jay said, his voice steady, stronger than it had ever been before. Robert's bloodshot eyes snapped toward him. "You're going to stay out of our way," Jay continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're not going to go near my dad. You're not going to go near me. You're going to disappear." Robert's lips curled into something bitter, but there was no real fight left in him. Jay held up his phone slightly, letting the glow of the screen catch Robert's eye. "You even think about showing your face again," Jay said, his voice sharp, cold, final, "and I'll make sure the entire town sees this." Robert's nostrils flared. Jay smirked. "Bet they'd love to watch how you lost a 4 against 1 fight." The words landed like a gunshot. David crossed his arms, watching as Robert's face went tight with the realization of just how deep his humiliation ran. Jay lowered the phone, pocketing it. "This is over," he said, his voice unwavering. "Walk away." Robert hesitated for a second. It looked like he might try one last act of defiance, one last attempt to hold on to whatever pride he had left. But he didn't. He just pushed himself up onto shaking legs, breathing hard, his entire body defeated in a way that no amount of words could ever undo. And then finally, he turned and left. Jay watched as he climbed back into the SUV, his men following without a single word. The tires screeched against the pavement as they sped off into the night. And just like that, it was over. David rolled his shoulders, letting out a slow breath. "Well," he muttered, "that was unnecessary." Jay chuckled, shaking his head as they climbed back into the truck. Pulling back onto the road, the night air felt different, lighter, like it finally belonged to them. The halls of Rockford High felt different now, not just in the way students glanced in Jay's direction, not just in the way conversations seemed to shift when he walked past, but in something deeper, something that stretched beyond him, beyond what had happened between him and Troy, beyond the fights, beyond the battles that had led him here. The power in this school, the unspoken rules, the invisible lines, the hierarchy that had once seemed permanent, had cracked. And everyone felt it. Jay sat at his usual spot in the cafeteria. Except it wasn't really his usual spot anymore. It was better. The table that had once been half empty, the space where he had spent most of his lunches in silence, was now filled. Lauren was there. Dean, too. A few others he had never spoken to much before, but who had somehow become part of his new reality. "Guess what I heard this morning?" Lauren asked, a grin tugging at her lips as she leaned forward slightly. Jay raised a brow. "What?" Lauren glanced around dramatically before lowering her voice. "Troy transferred." Jay blinked. "Transferred?" Dean let out a low chuckle. Dude couldn't show his face here anymore. His dad got wrecked, he got wrecked, and now his whole family's acting like the town's out to get them. Jay exhaled, shaking his head. So that was it then. After everything. After years of running Rockford High like he was untouchable. After getting away with everything. After acting like he would always be on top. Troy was just gone. It wasn't satisfying in the way Jay had once imagined. There was no final confrontation. No dramatic exit. No last attempt at redemption or defiance. Troy had just disappeared. His place in the school erased as if he had never been there at all. Jay wasn't sure how he felt about that. But then he looked around at his table, at his friends. At the way people talked to him now, not with caution, not with curiosity, but with real respect, real connection, real acknowledgement. He had always thought that winning meant beating Troy, that everything would feel different when that happened. But now, as he sat there, as laughter rippled through the group, as people talked to him like he had always belonged here, he realized something. Winning wasn't about beating someone else. It was about knowing you didn't need to fight anymore. Lauren nudged his arm, pulling him out of his thoughts. "So, what do you think?" Jay took a slow breath, then let a small smirk cross his lips. "I think Rockford just got a whole lot quieter." Lauren grinned. "Yeah, but not boring. I mean, we still need you on the court for that pickup game after school." Jay laughed, shaking his head. "We'll see. I don't know if you're ready for me." Dean scoffed. "Oh, he's talking big now." The teasing continued, the conversation flowing naturally, effortlessly, something that would have felt impossible just weeks ago. But now, it felt like it had always been this way. Jay leaned back in his chair, watching, listening, letting himself settle into this new reality. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. He wasn't walking with his head down. He wasn't carrying a weight on his chest. For the first time, he was just living. And that, more than anything, was the real victory. The drive home was quiet, but it was the good kind of quiet. The kind that didn't need to be filled. The kind that came with a weight that wasn't heavy, but settled like the slow exhale of something finally finished. Jay sat in the passenger seat, watching the familiar streets pass by through the window. The soft hum of the truck's engine was the only sound between them. David had said nothing when he picked him up, just gave him that slight nod of acknowledgement as Jay slid into the seat. The kind of nod that said he already knew, that he didn't have to ask about school, didn't have to ask about how Jay felt, because he had already seen the answer written all over him. When they pulled into the driveway, David killed the engine, but he didn't move to get out right away. Instead, he sat there for a moment, fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel, his eyes still on the road ahead. Jay waited, knowing his father had something to say. And then he did. "You know," David started, exhaling through his nose. "When I was your age, I thought winning was about never losing." He leaned back slightly, tilting his head, as if remembering something distant, something long buried. Thought it meant being the strongest, the fastest, the smartest in the room. Thought it meant proving something to everyone who doubted me. Jay turned his head slightly, listening. David let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Didn't take me long to learn that wasn't it." His fingers tapped once against the wheel before finally turning his head toward Jay. "Winning is not about never losing. It's about what you do after you lose." Jay let the words settle for a moment. David tilted his head slightly. "You lost before, didn't you?" Jay swallowed, nodding. "Yeah, but you didn't stay down." Jay met his father's eyes. Something shifted inside his chest. Something settling in a way that had nothing to do with the fight, nothing to do with Troy, but everything to do with what had changed inside him. "I didn't stay down," he said quietly. David nodded, satisfied. "Good." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Nothing else needed to be said. Then finally, David huffed, pushing open his door. "Come on," he said, climbing out of the truck. "I don't know about you, but I'm starving." Jay smirked, shaking his head as he followed his father inside. The house was warm, familiar, carrying the scent of home. Jay dropped his bag near the door, stretching his arms over his head as David moved toward the kitchen, already rummaging through the fridge. "You never cook," Jay teased, leaning against the counter. David shot him a look, pulling out a couple of plates. "I made steaks last time." Jay chuckled. "Yeah, and I'm still trying to recover from the trauma." David let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You know, for someone who just won the biggest fight of his life, you sure do have a lot to say." Jay smirked, crossing his arms. "Guess I take after my old man." David paused just for a second. Then, with the slightest smirk, he shook his head. "Damn right you do." Jay exhaled, looking around the kitchen, at the familiar walls, at the home that had always been a place of strength, of lessons, of learning. And then, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had truly earned his place in it. His father glanced at him again, his voice softer this time, more real. "I'm proud of you, kid." Jay swallowed, feeling something tighten in his chest. He nodded. "I know." David let out a small breath, nodding once. "Good." And just like that, everything was right. The fight was over. The lessons had been learned. And Jay Collins had won, not because he beat someone else, but because for the first time in his life, he knew exactly who he was. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, streaks of gold stretching across Jay Collins's bedroom. For the first time in years, he didn't wake up with a knot in his stomach. The silence of the house wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't the silence of avoidance or tension. It was peace. He stretched, pulling himself out of bed, the faint soreness in his muscles, a reminder of everything that had led him here. Not just the fights, not just the bruises, but the training, the lessons, the countless mornings where his father had pushed him past the point of exhaustion. The ache wasn't pain anymore. It was proof proof that he was stronger now, inside and out. Downstairs, he could hear the clatter of dishes, the low hum of the radio his father always turned on in the mornings. It was ordinary, familiar, but somehow, after everything, it felt new, different. When Jay walked into the kitchen, David glanced up from the stove, a spatula in hand. The man who rarely cooked, who once swore his battlefield skills didn't extend to breakfast, now stood flipping eggs with a surprising ease. "You're up late," David said casually, though the corner of his mouth quirked into the faintest of smirks. Jay smirked back. "It's Saturday." David slid a plate across the counter. "Saturday doesn't mean you get to sleep your life away. Fighters don't make excuses." Jay chuckled, shaking his head as he sat down. "Guess that explains why you're making eggs instead of steaks this time." David shot him a dry look. "Careful. You're not too old to run laps before breakfast." They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that came not from a lack of words but from a bond that didn't need them. For Jay, it was still strange, this quiet acceptance between them. This shift from lessons taught through lectures to lessons that lived in the space between breaths. Halfway through his meal, David leaned back in his chair, studying his son the way only a father could. "You feel it yet?" Jay paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "Feel what?" "The difference." David gestured vaguely toward him. "In here, in you." Jay set his fork down, considering. He thought back to Rockford High. The way students looked at him differently now. Not with pity, not with mockery, but with respect. He thought about Lauren's smirk, Dean's fist bump, the laughter at the cafeteria table that didn't feel like it was at his expense for once. He thought about Troy walking away, shoulders slumped, arrogance gone. "Yeah," Jay admitted softly. "I feel it." David nodded, satisfied. "Good. Just remember, it's not about one fight. It's about who you are after. That's what lasts." Jay let the words settle, the weight of them as grounding as the morning sun spilling across the table. Later that afternoon, Jay found himself walking through the halls of Rockford High again. The weekend meant they were nearly empty, only a few teachers lingering, the echo of his footsteps filling the space. It was strange seeing the lockers without Troy leaning against them. Strange hearing the quiet without the background hum of whispered insults or mocking laughter. For years this building had felt like a battlefield he could never win. Now it was just school. He stopped at his locker, running his fingers across the cool metal, remembering every time books had been knocked from his hands, every shove, every taunt. The ghosts of those moments were still here, but they didn't sting anymore. They were shadows, and shadows couldn't touch him now. "Thought I might find you here?" a voice called. Jay turned to see Lauren walking toward him, her backpack slung lazily over one shoulder, her grin as sharp as ever. "You stalking me now?" Jay asked, smirking. Lauren rolled her eyes. "Please, don't flatter yourself. I just figured you'd come back here, make some big dramatic reflection about how far you've come." "Guess you were right," Jay admitted, shutting his locker. Lauren leaned against the one beside his, her expression softening. "You know, people are still talking. About you, about what happened." Jay raised a brow. "Yeah?" "Yeah," Lauren's smirk returned. "You're kind of a big deal now." "Hero of Rockford High," Jay laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "That's not what it was about." "I know," Lauren said. "But that's what they see. Sometimes, that's enough." Jay didn't respond right away. He just let the words hang in the air, feeling the truth in them. That evening, Jay and David stood in the backyard. The sun had dipped low, streaks of orange and violet cutting across the horizon. The old punching bag swayed gently in the breeze, worn leather scarred from months of strikes. David handed Jay a pair of gloves. "One last round?" Jay pulled them on, flexing his fingers, the weight familiar. He took his stance, balanced, steady. David circled him slowly, eyes sharp but calm. The first exchange was quick, controlled jabs, practiced blocks, neither of them looking to win, only to feel the rhythm, the dance they had repeated so many times before. But something was different now. Jay wasn't reacting anymore. He was anticipating, moving with a confidence that hadn't existed before. David saw it. He felt it, and for the first time, he eased back, letting his son take the lead. When Jay landed a clean strike, David grinned, lowering his guard. "Now you're thinking." Jay smirked, breath even, his chest rising and falling steadily. He wasn't just sparring anymore, he was standing as an equal. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Jay sat on his bed, phone in hand. He scrolled past the endless messages, the videos, the whispers that had once defined him. Now, they were just noise. He opened the camera roll and paused at the clip he had recorded, the one of Robert on the ground, humiliated, defeated. His finger hovered over the screen for a long moment. Then he deleted it, because he didn't need it anymore. The proof wasn't in the video. It wasn't in what anyone else saw. It was in him. Jay lay back, staring at the ceiling, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was waiting for the next blow, the next insult, the next fight. For the first time, he was free. The following Monday, as he walked into Rockford High, students turned to look. Whispers rippled down the hall, but this time, Jay didn't lower his head. He walked steady, confident, certain. Lauren caught his eye from across the hall, giving him a nod. Dean raised his hand in greeting. Others followed, and Jay Collins smiled, because he knew, finally, fully, undeniably, who he was. The echoes of Rockford High had quieted, but the lesson that lingered was louder than any fight, any verdict, any whispered rumor in its hallways. Jay Collins's journey was never truly about fists or bruises. It was about finding the strength to stand tall when the world pressed down, about refusing to let fear dictate who you are meant to become. For years he had walked those halls with his head lowered, his silence mistaken for weakness. Yet silence had been his survival. And then came the moment when survival was no longer enough, when he had to choose between staying down or rising up. With his father's steady hand and relentless lessons, Jay learned that real victory is not the absence of loss, but the refusal to surrender to it. There is something universal in that truth. Every community, every school, every street corner knows the shadow of bullies. Those who believe power is taken through intimidation, that respect can be forced by fear. But what Jay's story shows us is that power built on cruelty is fragile. It crumbles the moment someone dares to push back with discipline, with resilience, with an unshakable sense of self. Violence may have sparked the story, but the heart of it lies elsewhere. It lies in a boy realizing that strength is not in the punch you throw, but in the control you wield. It lies in a father teaching his son that battles are not won by rage, but by knowing when to fight and when to rise above. And it lies in a community that finally saw through the illusion of untouchability, understanding that silence in the face of cruelty only feeds its fire. Perhaps that is the real takeaway, that each of us carries the choice, to be complicit in the laughter that isolates someone, or to stand, however quietly, on the side of what is right, to be the whisper that fuels cruelty, or the voice that interrupts it. Every school, every workplace, every circle of friends has its own Rockford, and every Jay waiting for a sign that he is not alone. So when you finish this story, ask yourself, what would you do if you were there in that hallway? Would you avert your eyes, convincing yourself it wasn't your fight? Or would you step closer, lend your strength, and remind the world that bullies only thrive when the rest of us give them silence? Stories like this are not told to glorify fists or confrontation. They are told because they carry lessons bigger than one boy, one school, one town. They are reminders that dignity is worth defending, that courage often looks quiet until it is forced to roar, and that sometimes the strongest inheritance a parent can give their child is not protection, but the tools to protect themselves. Jay Collins walked out of Rockford not just as a survivor, not just as a fighter, but as proof that even in the darkest corners, change is possible. And his father, David, showed us that guidance, discipline, and love can transform silence into strength. Now, I turn to you. What did this story awaken in you? Have you seen moments where silence fed cruelty, or moments where courage broke it apart? Share your thoughts below, because conversations like these ripple outward, shaping communities far beyond Rockford. And if stories with heart, with grit, with meaning are what you seek, then stay with us. There are more voices to be heard, more lessons to uncover, more victories to be claimed. Subscribe to Raw Black Stories so you never miss the next chapter. Because stories are not just entertainment, they are reminders of who we are and who we can choose to be.